It's my great honour to welcome you all.
It is a very prestigious award. It means the world to me.
They have great senses of humour.
I like to reveal parts of history to them, for I love making history come alive.
They are some of the best people that you can come across.
To help them open their hearts.
I always come back to this quote. How can we be role models to learners if we're not learners ourselves?
It's quite useful to get out of our bubbles, not our COVID ones, and sort of see what else is out there.
By sharing best practice, we can see the whole picture. We can see what really matters.
One of the biggest brains around.
It's easy to forget how much has to happen behind the front line.
As a global schools group, Cognita educates over 55,000 students across 12 countries. We're proud to be Wellbeing Partner at this year's Festival of Education, and we want to share the work that we're doing to prioritise children's well-being. This starts with a clear understanding of what well-being is. We looked at the evidence and created a simple Be Well Charter that everyone can use day to day. It gives a clear definition of well-being and then focuses on the specific contributors that influence it. Discover our full Be Well Charter video and other resources to use with your students and families at cognita.com.
I really try to not look at myself as just a science teacher. I feel like as a teacher, it's very important to help students grow and develop outside of your lessons. A single teacher believing in you and really believing in you. One teacher doing that can have a large impact, but if you have one or two or three all telling you that and really, really believing in it, it makes you feel like you can achieve anything in the world, honestly.
Welcome to this Festival of Education keynote session, part of the annual Festival of Education, taking place online from the 16th to the 30th of June. This year's festival is free for all teachers and educationalists across education in the UK and beyond. This has only been possible thanks to the support of our incredible partners. A huge thank you to our headline partner, Pearson, our festival partners, BBC Bitesize, Cognita and Teach First, our literary festival partner, Bloomsbury Publishing, and our organising partner, Wellington College, the home of the Festival of Education. We'd also like to thank our incredible speakers. Over 200 leading educationalists and thought leaders will be providing sessions at this year's festival. On behalf of the audience and organisers, thank you. It's time to sit back and get set for our upcoming keynote session. If you wish to ask a question during this session, please head over to our Slido page to submit questions and vote for your favourites. Enjoy this Festival of Education keynote session.
Hello and welcome to this session on the future of assessment. We've got the next hour to engage with findings from a consultation that Pearson have completed that explores what good looks like in relation to the qualifications and assessment system for 14 to 19-year-olds. The experiences in the education system during the COVID pandemic has sharpened the focus on some of the most fundamental questions about the purpose of education, what we want from our young people to learn and how we should assess them. The range of recent publications, policy, research, thought pieces in this space have ranged from calling for whole-scale reform, reforming GCSEs, removing GCSEs from the qualifications landscape, proposing various shades of baccalaureate-style solutions to adjust the academic and vocational parity, and most recently a reform of qualifications to low-stakes digital assessments by 2025. But what is clear throughout all of this is that the solutions stem from different perspectives of where different parts of the education system are failing the individuals that it seeks to serve, namely our students. And so for this reason that we were really keen to give the importance of the most fundamental question about what good looks like to a wide range of stakeholders in the education system. Specifically, voices that are often lost in this discussion from students and teachers. And we're going to explore some of this research and the findings with a fantastic panel, expert panel, Hayley Dalton from Pearson, Tristan Arnison from Henley College, and Peter Kirkbride from Greenwood Academies Trust to bring some of these findings to life. So without hearing too much from me, I'll hand over to the panel to introduce themselves and some first reflections on the report. Hayley.
Thanks, Lizzie. Just by way of introduction, I was one of the research leads on the report, and but I should say my background is actually in teaching in the post-16 sector, which I did for about 15 years before I came to Pearson. So in thinking about this report, we really wanted to go back to the grassroots level in terms of garnering a really wide and varied viewpoint across the whole spectrum about just the purposes of Key Stage 4 and the post-16 phase, and really understanding, as Lizzie said, what some of those sometimes unheard stakeholder views were, as well as those of teachers and a number of experts across the board in education. And we quite deliberately did that broad brush approach in this first phase, and our approach was probably reasonably conservative with a small c, in that we really wanted to get to the fundamentals, the basics. What do people think education's for, and what do they think's wrong with it? And I didn't. I'm not going to go into too much of those details now, and they'll come out, no doubt, in the discussion. But just a couple of, I think, key points to share if you haven't read the interim report, is that probably differently to some of the other research that's coming out at the moment, ours really our stakeholders have told us really that they're interested in something quite evolutionary rather than revolutionary at this phase. That there's a lot that's right in the education system. Exams are valued, qualifications are valued. They're really important ways of filtering and sorting young people into the right routes at various points in their lives. But there are things missing. There are elements of choice and flexibility that they'd like to see. There are some concerns about how the accountability systems sometimes skew outcomes for young people. And there are concerns about, as we've seen in other research, about how the education system treats all learners fairly. Thank you.
Thanks, Hayley, for introducing the report. Pete, would you like to share some reflections from your perspective in a multi-academy trust?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm Pete Kirkbride. I'm one of the senior education advisors at GAT. 36 academies, 17,000 students all around this region, and I lead the secondary raising achievement strand. Well, your question was two things: what struck a chord and what was surprised. Would you like me to talk a bit about both of those?
Yes, please.
So look, I mean, when I read the report, all of it resonated with me, and I think this kind of work and these kind of findings are really valuable at the moment. We need this level of reflection rather than some of the rhetoric and misconceptions that are out there, and often that is of a political persuasion. I think it highlighted that people value choice. But I think to us on the ground, it feels like things are narrowing very quickly. And I'm sure that's something we'll unpick. I think schools should have high levels of accountability. We've got to drive school improvement. We know that, and assessment is part of it. But you get what you measure. And I think that's a key point when we're looking at assessment and whether we've got the right blend. Things I was a bit surprised at. I thought there might be a bit more discussion about the importance of destinations and where these assessments are taking our learners to. And I really felt GAT works with some of the most disadvantaged communities, and I really felt that group was missing in this report, and it would be good to unpick that. We've got a model of assessment at the moment where a third of our learners, predominantly disadvantaged, are not hitting those kind of gold standard grades in English and maths. And I think values-wise, we've really got to pause and reflect on that. So I'm sure that will come up as we go forward.
I think anything from the pandemic has really kind of shone a light on, even more so, the kind of potential disadvantages that individual students are facing. So I think absolutely we need to come onto that, because that's one of the areas that the system is failing, and we do need to find better ways to address that in some of the solutions that are put forward. Thanks, Pete. Tristan, I'd like to introduce you and some kind of reflections. Again, we have what's surprising, what struck a chord with you. That'd be great.
Sure thing, Lizzie. My name is Tristan. I'm a head of faculty at a sixth form college in Oxfordshire. And I would say it's really interesting reading through the report, because I think that there's significant parts of it that fit in what you suspect might be the view of stakeholders at this in time. And one of those aspects, as Hayley said, is actually a valuing of qualifications that we offer, and a trust in certain types of qualifications that we offer. And her point about evolutionary change rather than radical change, which I thought struck a chord. But I think there were particular parts of the report that surprised me slightly. I think I'll give an example, the survey looking at 19 to 24-year-olds in work, and what they valued most in terms of skills development from their education. And it was really interesting to see that social skills was the thing that trumped everything else by a very considerable margin. And that's not necessarily something that we always think about in the first instance when we think about the importance of skills development within educational settings, to have that pointed out as being, the most significant to those young people. And I also thought it was interesting that certain perceptions differ. So there's a kind of mismatch between, say, teachers' perceptions of how students use online resources and how students themselves report their use of online resources. And I thought that was an interesting gap, that teachers would appear to assume that students are using online materials far more than they actually are, which was quite striking.
Thanks, Tristan. I think the skills questions are a really important one. This is probably an area that I want to start first, really, because earlier on in the week there was a session looking at employability skills and the importance of that within the school system, and what does that mean? How do we define that? And kind of skills in its broadest sense. Actually, there's some of the soft skills that employers are valuing most. So it brings me to my first real question then, which is, what should the 14 to 19-year-old students have exposure to in their curriculum, and what aspects of that should actually sit within maybe a qualification or get some kind of recognition, formal recognition through the system? What would be of value? What do we want to see these students be able to come out with and be proud of? Pete, may I come to you first?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, because it's the kind of question I want to hear and get into the debate about, but actually the accountability systems and some of the structures that we operate in mean that I'd probably give two different answers depending on which hat I'm wearing at a particular time. Both as a head and in my current job, I often use the kind of mantra of, is it good enough for my child? And I think, of course, all of those skills of leadership and creativity, teamwork, communication, research, all of those skills are absolutely things that I would want my boys to develop. However, when you look at how tight the curriculum is, and some of those accountability frameworks that we spoke about, there's a real tension, and I've got some sympathy with elements of this, a real tension to get through the content, to get through the spec, to get the exam skills and understanding in place. So I feel for school leaders, because there's what we'd like to do, and there's a bit of what we feel we have to do, and in the middle is our values as school leaders about where we're going to draw the line and what we're going to make happen in our schools. And actually, I think you'd find that most, if not all schools in this country walk a really great line between spinning both of those plates and sending their young people out ready for the world of work and being a grown-up.
That tension came through kind of from all avenues, actually, kind of, I think, through the research, and I hear time and time again in all of this this area how challenging it is, and actually how maybe that might not give you the freedom to do what actually you think is the best thing to do. However, accountability, as you said at the beginning, is important. Hayley, would you like to share some of what the research did find on this?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, across the board, we had some interesting things, some things that you wouldn't expect. I mean, the overwhelmingly, its skills across the board were felt to be really important, and right from the kind of the academic skills, the analytical, critical analysis, all of those things, right through to the life skills and the communication skills that Pete just mentioned. What was really interesting was one intersection of the data were the group that we surveyed that were most interested in the life skills, the life knowledge, being able to sort your finances out, cook yourself healthy meals, the kind of the basics of life, if you like. A lot of that came from employers. Actually, employers really felt that was an area that was missing. In terms of the things they saw. I echo the tension with the accountability point. That came through very clear in a lot of the written responses we had from teachers and parents and pupils, was they felt this tension between what they felt they had to do and what may have been beneficial. And another point, if I may, just to finish my bit, is and this is not new. This isn't new findings. I've been involved in research 2 or 3 years ago with a Russell Group University, where we looked at how students who have done BTEC courses from state schools compare with young people that have done other sorts of qualifications from independent schools, and how they fare in their first year of university. And what that showed us was actually the academic skills are not that different. It's about the communication, the cultural capital, the self-advocacy skills that lots of young people are missing, perhaps because they've been driven down other routes of having to achieve in other ways, led by accountability measures, and that's really having quite a negative impact on them, certainly in their first few years out of school.
I think that brings Tristan in nicely from a college perspective, and the freedom, because the accountability systems are a bit different. I suppose they're kind of driven mainly by funding, but Tristan.
I think there is a tension that you rightly identify, but I think there's also there's also opportunity in that sort of struggle between, you know, content, skills, accountability. When you look at, you know, assessment objectives for courses, what often strikes me is how many skills are hidden within those assessment objectives. Very important key skills. When you look at the kinds of skills that, you know, employers value particularly highly in terms of problem solving, critical thinking skills, things like that, you find those embedded often within assessment objectives. But when students experience the taught content in class, it's not necessarily clear to them that those hidden skills within the AOs are coming into their lived experience in the classroom, and how those skills can then be applied in other contexts incredibly successfully. So I think there's almost a piece of work in terms of how we make explicit these hidden skills, how we draw out the implicit and make it much clearer to students, and how we possibly link what we do in the classroom with external skills frameworks to model progress and development of particular skills. So I think there are ways in which we can help resolve that tension to a degree. There was a quote in the report that I really liked from a secondary school teacher, which talked about the fact that we haven't really hit the mark in terms of modeling what it means to be a critical thinker, and I thought that was relevant to my kind of thinking about how we in the classroom model the use of skills in terms of approaching content in a very obvious way, so students realize and make those connections.
It sounds like there's a bit more we can do to try and bring some of that out, bring some of that to life, not only just through the delivery and the teaching of it, but actually maybe some of the recognition work, kind of looking at different parts of the system to kind of amplify how some of those skills kind of draw that thread through for individual students, and that can be transferred. That's what I'm hearing?
That's exactly it. And I think, you know, there's a lot that can be done within what we have that we don't necessarily capitalize upon in a meaningful way, or maybe don't always value in our approach to it.
And Pete, just sort of bringing you back in here, do you think that is sort of a similar thread in schools? Because one of the things that I've heard from some of the research discussions that we've had around this report has been Key Stage 4 in particular is jam-packed full of stuff. Like, how do you actually decide what should be in, what should be out? Is there enough time to draw out some of this kind of richness from some of this sort of curriculum matter?
I think there's a big discussion and debate in education at the moment about how we enrich the curriculum, how we bring that knowledge to life. Just this morning, I've been on a call for most of the day with GATS 8 secondary science leaders. And that you can see that tension about the passion for the subject, the curiosity, the excitement they want to instill in their students, the pondweed dipping and all the other activities they want to do, versus the sheer amount of knowledge and content to get through on that spec. and as I've touched on, all of the other bits of that are so relevant, the exam strategy work, understanding what the examiner wants to see, how you'd apply that, the extended writing, the list goes on and on. So I think particularly at Key Stage 4, there is a real tension of delivering 8 or 9 subjects really effectively and enriching them, often in a school curriculum that is perhaps 25 taught hours a week. And without sounding like a broken record, coming back to that pressure for staff and students to be getting those 4s, those 5s, those targets. Having led a school with a very big sixth form, I can relate perhaps to some of Tristan's points. I think I found with Key Stage 5, I found it a lot easier to enrich the wider curriculum, and naturally they're going down to perhaps 3 subjects. You might find you've got 10 or so hours in a week, depending on how you use their non-contact time, to be able to enrich that and bring in some of those not just skills, but also that opportunity to get out and work in the community, work with employers, etc. But at Key Stage 4, it feels incredibly tight, and I think the students feel that and the staff feel it. I feel like I'm a bit doom and gloom there, Lizzie. I don't mean to be.
Not at all, not at all. I think what's really important from this discussion is that there are very much differences between Key Stage 4, Key Stage 5, and actually when you go down through the other key stages, kind of exploring it's the coherence of the system actually, and how everything kind of starts to build and complement it. And we understand the kind of niche things that are going on within those particular year groups that we would want to perhaps tackle to try and kind of really realise some of the improvements that we kind of feel like made. So not all doom and gloom at all. It's really useful discussion. Thank you. I think it brings me nicely onto my next question, which is kind of, do we limit choice too early? Because I think, Pete, you kind of took it, it's all jam-packed in. It feels like there's a lot of choice there, but actually really is there a lot of choice? Hayley, I wondered if you could just talk us through a little bit about what the research was taking us through, and then maybe Tristan and Pete will come to you next.
Yeah, thanks, Lizzie. There was quite a lot on this in the research, and so I'll just summarise, but we've actually got a lot more data than's in the report, and sometimes I forget what's in the report and what's in the technical annex. But certainly there was a feeling that in the post-16 phase, there's definitely an issue with the route that learners feel that they need to go down at that age. So it's as if they've spent Key Stage 4 in almost this marathon sprint to the line to get these 7, 8, 9 GCSE subjects done and grades that they need, and then they are put into what feels to some learners like fairly narrow tracks. And I guess it's compounded by a funding issue post-16, where many learners only have 16 or 17 hours of contact at college. So it's a relatively short amount of time in a week compared to what they've had at school. And then they may be selecting A-levels because they have an eye on university, they understand what they need to do to get to university, but they're still quite interested, as young people, they're developing, they're becoming quite curious vocationally. What am I good at? What sort of things do I like doing? And there's really not very much scope to do that within the post-16 phase if they're very focused on a particular route into university sometimes, or at least that's how they perceive it. So I think that's one aspect. There's another kind of link to choice aspect that came up not just from stakeholder groups but also our experts and kind of wider literature, which is the issue that kind of comes around again, is the fact that they don't necessarily continue core subjects post-16 as well, and whether that is having a limiting impact on them, and particularly for young people who don't achieve good GCSE passes in those subjects at school. It feels like a real deficit model for them to then embark on what could be this fresh start post-16. What am I interested in? What do I want to be when I go into work? They've got this deficit model of things that they haven't achieved at school, and it's very difficult for them to catch up. So I think for me, the choice is really impacting progression for some learners in particular.
Thanks, Hayley. Tristan.
Yeah, I think the question of choice is a really interesting one, and the shift from Key Stage 4 to 5 is quite a dramatic one. And as you were saying, that there is an issue Key Stage 5 with the number of hours that you have, available. So typically taught hours, you're looking at sort of 12 to 15 hours in different institutions. That's the sort of amount that you're looking at, which is not a great deal when you compare to what's come before. I think I have slightly conflicting views on this based on my own experience. So I was educated partly abroad, and I experienced a baccalaureate style qualification as a school leavers qualification, and then experienced A-levels here in the UK. And I know that for me, there was a real relief in being able to do just the subjects that I wanted to focus in on. And it actually was quite an exciting opportunity. But I knew very clearly what I wanted to do. And I knew what the things were that interested me. So I think that there is a learner who's in that position who really appreciates that opportunity. But I'm not sure that necessarily applies across the board. It clearly doesn't. I also think there's a difference in the nature of experience that students have doing, say, an extended diploma at level 3 versus an A-level program. And I think sometimes, interestingly enough, although an extended diploma may have a single focus in a particular area, sometimes some students feel that they actually have more breadth across the unit coverage than they might do within an A-level study program. So even though it revolves around one thing, because of the variety within the units relating to that one thing, you get a different type of experience. I think it's a tricky one to resolve, the question of choice and whether choice is limited too early or not, because there is a very real individual component to it in terms of where students are at and what they want to go on and do. And it's also been interesting to see how sort of attempts to launch baccalaureate style qualifications haven't necessarily worked within the UK across the past 20 years. There hasn't necessarily been the buy-in amongst students and parents, which I think in and of itself is something we probably should take note of. But yeah, I think that there are a lot of good arguments for widening out breadth. The question is how you do that in a balanced way. And I think Hayley's point about students, the forgotten third, those students who have to retake GCSE maths and English, I think that's something that needs a huge amount of careful thought and review, because that, you look at the data on that nationally, and it seems a rather broken way of working, and I'm not sure that we're helping our students through that particular hamster wheel of retakes.
Thanks, Tristan. I'm hearing sort of, the experience is individual, isn't it, really? And actually some kind of flexibility in the system is important for the diversity of the students that take these qualifications and kind of, perform at different levels at different times in their career as well. Pete, Key Stage 4, obviously, this group of students that have kind of this continual kind of failure label on them, kind of, and how that maybe links to kind of choice, because it feels like there's a lot of choice, but then equally there's perhaps a limit on choice depending on your perspective. Do you want to talk us through your views on this?
Yeah, I think it's really difficult. And Tristan's point, I mean, I'm reading Rachel McFarlane's book Obstetrics for Schools at the moment, and I think I pronounced that wrong, but a great book, and it really highlights that issue. What other organisation or part of our society would we accept a third of the participants to fail as we went into that process? Now, I'm using fail against that definition, that kind of gold standard that you hear used in society, and I think that's part of the issue here when we talk about assessment. I thought it was interesting that employers talk about the skills in the report, and yet my experience is they're still looking at what what is perhaps considered the gold standard around the 4, the 5, the A-level, the GCSE. And I think there was a graph in the report that really highlighted the value of GCSE and A-level over those vocational subjects. So there is something hardwired into our assessment system at the moment that is broken, frankly, when the most disadvantaged, most vulnerable aren't able to leave after, 12 years of compulsory education with a sense of success. And I don't believe that a third of that third of students go on not to generate tax revenue for the country or head into successful employment. So when we look at the question of assessment, I know that issue isn't just addressed by what we're talking about today. It is about curriculum and standards in school and behaviour and staffing shortages and all of those other complexities. To come back to the wider point, though, I think there are some things that we as school leaders can reflect on. I think with clever curriculum design, we can support some of these subjects better. The core maths going into the sixth form, the EPQs. And I've seen some amazing examples of schools who are constrained, as we've discussed, but doing really creative curriculum models. So one of the schools I work with directly, Nottingham Academy, an amazing program around sports with a local Wildcats basketball team, where they learn to play basketball and end up with level 3 qualifications. Bosworth Academy in Leicestershire, apprenticeships agreed with JCB and Next, where as the students step into the sixth form, they go through a job interview, and if their attendance is high and if they finish their vocational course, at the end of it they step into a job. I mean, these are amazing examples of school leaders being creative to make the system work. And lastly, at Brook Weston, the academy in sixth form I ran before stepping into this job, I got quite excited by the international baccalaureate approach. And when I looked at things like the careers-related baccalaureate, where students study a BTEC or a vocational course, and they've got skills and experiences wrapped around that, I could see a really exciting pathway through using our current limitations. However, we're back to things like you're only going to be able to do A-levels or T-levels, as opposed to this kind of rich dialogue that we're trying to have today. So there are ways around it. I think there's ways to make that forgotten third much more successful. But at the moment, there's a real challenge with the current structure and the pace, as well as our social economic challenges and COVID. As you said, Lizzie, which has really added to that, particularly in schools like we have in GAT.
I think if I could add that, I think one of the things that's actually been a limiting factor in very recent years are the reforms to A-levels and the return to the linear structure and the move away from Curriculum 2000. Because I know what we found was that with students doing typically 4 AS levels in year 1, they would experiment with the kinds of subjects that they chose, and they would choose something that maybe was a bit more risky or something that they hadn't done before, and they would discover something new and extraordinary, and that would really sort of motivate them moving forward. But I think the return to the linear structure and 3 things across 2 years has limited that, and the emphasis on certain subjects over others has also been a limiting factor. I know that we have seen, and I think this is reflected in national data, that niche subject areas have really struggled with that move, and there's the sense of choice limiting on that front as well, which I think is a sad thing to see.
It strikes me that there's kind of a differences of views of kind of being dictating almost what kind of subject content, what subjects are important, you don't know this is important for you, but we know better, so you need to study this. Balanced kind of, or kind of juxtaposed, I can't even say it, with the perspective of choice and flexibility, and I'm the kind of master of my own destiny type thing. And I think there's a really interesting lens to look at kind of particularly the 14 to 19-year-olds, is that what I think we're hearing from the research is that they do have good opinion. They've got, they've got value, they've got their own mind, they know what they want. And to what extent, I suppose, as educators, should we be shepherding through to them to help them make the right decisions, or should the kind of system be dictating what they should be and either limiting or exposing what they should be studying? Be interested in your thoughts on that.
There was a fascinating bit of data in the report looking at, the reasons that students choose the courses that they do. And it struck me as being quite odd that follow my interests would be the lowest thing on the list. That really stuck with me. And your point about the kind of overarching expectations shaping what people do rather than perhaps what they think for themselves as students seems to be in part borne out by that kind of response.
I think students, I've worked now in schools across every Ofsted category and level of deprivation. I think the common theme is our young people are really passionate, they're desperate to be successful, and often the fine balance is schools being the wise parent about this, and bringing that kind of professional wisdom and expertise, as you said, against giving agency to the students. And I think that's a real tension. I think that careers advice, options, those kind of how those are managed are really important in these discussions. And linked to that is about making sure that all of these courses or assessment routes are absolutely valued. And I think we touched on it earlier that I know when I first arrived at Brook Western, there was a view that if you weren't going to university, you weren't on a pathway that was of interest or matters. And actually, those other assessment routes and some of the amazing apprenticeship opportunities that are out there, just incredible and so exciting. And if I was back, I'm a long way from 18, but if I was back at 18, I'd be absolutely jumping on some of those things. That said, I think there are some, I work with a school in Nottingham, the Wells Academy, over 60% pupil premium. And we're absolutely certain and relentless that academic excellence matters, and that you should be studying maths and science and geography and history and the languages. And students have absolutely embraced that and bought into that within the kind of warmth and clear standards that we have sat behind that. Sometimes you've got to show them the possible, haven't you? And all of that comes together. And assessment, I know we're talking about assessment today, but assessment is part of that puzzle, I guess, not the whole thing. It's a really tricky one to walk. And the idea that students can drop geography or history at 14, drop maths at 16, I mean, none of it quite sits right with us when you think about what an education should look like. Again, coming back to what would you want for your child? And that's a real tension. On the flip side, sorry to waffle, Lizzie, but we have seen historically, because of the accountability measures, sometimes people not making wise decisions about the curriculum they offer. And I think some of the changes that have been put in place there with accountability has been really helpful, actually. I'm not sure ECDL was a massively valuable qualification for many students.
Thanks, Pete. And yeah, it brings us back down to accountability again. Is a kind of interesting point to circle back on. Just reading a couple of the comments that have come through. There's a question here, and I think it is important to discuss assessment here, because I think there's a couple of questions. Really, what opportunities could we seize with the pandemic, and what role might digital play in the future of assessment? I think linked to that, there's a question that's come through about how can assessment be broadened out from kind of written exams to maybe better or more validly measure content in a meaningful way, but still maintaining some sufficient levels of reliability. I don't know, Hayley, if you want to just drop in what we found from our research.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly overwhelmingly, digital is a massive opportunity now and has certainly accelerated in the past 18 months. I mean, just to make a general point about exams, sometimes I think we talk about these things like it's a zero-sum situation where, exams good or bad, coursework good or bad. Overwhelmingly, everybody we spoke to really values exams, however they're delivered, online, on paper. There's totally a place for them, and learners right across the spectrum see them as important. That having that independence, that externality, that rigor to validate learning is important to everybody. But I think there is a place for thinking creatively about how we can measure all of those other things that learners are doing that we have typically not been able to assess because of constraints that we may have had or feel we had about the system of assessment. Teachers certainly feel like they have a bigger role to play than they do at the moment in assessment. They were very conscious of workload and of how much expertise they have, but we had one interesting point that came out from our expert panel was, should we be looking at assessment expertise as an interesting career progression for teachers who really want to go down that route? Plenty of teachers trained to do certain areas of expertise within their role, and there's definitely a role for teachers who really want to play a part of that. And digital, I would imagine, is a really great opportunity to think about how teachers can interact with learners in an interesting way and provide them with that feedback, whether it's formative or summative. I think there's a lot of opportunity, certainly in vocational areas, to be doing that now.
Yeah.
Thanks, Hayley. Tristan?
I think that's a really good point, and linking the kind of pandemic and assessment, it's interesting to think about the resilience of different types of qualifications, in the context that we've seen. We talk a lot about resilience in relation to students, but we don't necessarily think about it in relation to qualification types, perhaps. But the A-level assessment kind of structure was broken almost immediately. Whereas when you look at applied general qualifications, it was a much easier thing, I think, in general, to adapt to the circumstances and to work with what you had and change what you needed to change. It was, I think, a much better way of working. Whereas I think the linear A-level structure, that was gone. That method of assessment had disappeared, and you had to reinvent the wheel. But I think for many of our teaching staff at our college, although that's been an exhausting process, I know that several of them have commented on the way in which they've really enjoyed getting to grips with the principles of assessment in working through the CAGs and the tags. And I think that links to what you're saying, Hayley, about kind of understanding how assessment works and thinking about, what constitutes fair, valid assessment. And we've seen teaching staff across the country wrestling with those issues in a really, in-depth way this summer, which is quite something. But I think you're right. Clearly, exams are important, aren't they? They're an important part of what we do. But it's the balance and how you mix things together that's key. And I think there's also the question of what purpose different types of assessments serve, and what kinds of skills do they develop. And resting too heavily on one type of assessment arguably doesn't help develop a broader range of skills. And make explicit that skills development in the way that perhaps a more mixed economy might do.
Thanks, Tristan. Pete, can you kind of explore a little bit about how kind of over the pandemic, digital kind of has accelerated in the learning journey, and therefore how that might relate to some of the assessment opportunities that are out there?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that perhaps historically education haven't been early adopters But for sure, COVID has got all of us online and much more IT savvy. So I think there is going to be a payoff going forwards. People are much more comfortable embracing that technology now. And we've made massive jumps. You know, I was in headship when COVID started, and I think we went from never having Teams or Zoom to, you know, living off it in the space of a week. It was absolutely amazing. I think the tension is that what the CAGs have shown. I mean, I've supported 8 academies through the CAG process, and I've watched staff act with real integrity, incredible professionalism and hard work. And yes, as Tristan said, having their professionalism trusted, and them being allowed to apply their knowledge and their wisdom and their expertise. And they've made tough decisions during that process. But outside of the CAGs, we've increasingly seen an assessment system that perhaps doesn't trust teachers as much as it should. And I accept it should be blended. But it's very much moved to that summative assessment, externally examined. And again, without sounding like a broken record, I think that is part of that third that we keep talking about, because certainly once you leave school, how often is all of your success measured on one hour exam? So I think, and I know with some of the reforms that are coming up with applied and vocational courses, we're seeing that exam element increased again, aren't we? Because we keep coming back to that view in this country that for it to count and for the learning to matter and for your grade to have value to the employer, you must have slogged it through 3 2-hour exams in absolute silence in the baking heat of a sports hall. And actually, I think there just needs to be some more wisdom and discussion about, as Tristan said, how do we get that blended right, and how do we trust the people that know our students the best? You know, I think that would be my response to that.
Thanks, Pete. We've only got a few minutes left, and I think we've kind of covered ground from skills all the way through to assessment, to training teachers in different ways about assessment and the real passion for students. I think kind of in the final moments, it would be great to hear from each of you about kind of one thing you would like to see from our education system that might make the most difference into our next generation of students. If we could just make that one kind of tweak, change thing, move forward, kind of, yeah, from your view. Pete, shall we start with you?
Well, I think I've probably said it 3 or 4 times. I think the risk of the kind of mantra of good enough for my child is that often we've been through the assessment system we've been discussing today. My wife, we're very good at exams, we're good at retaining knowledge, and we've been successful because of that. And I think what we need is a really good debate about who's not gaining and who's not benefiting from that system. And you know, without getting too philosophical or cheesy, you know, if the most vulnerable groups in our society are being failed by the system, there's something fundamentally broken. So I'd really like us to look at the blended approach, the language around what is the gold standard, in terms of academic, applied, or other routes. And for that third, I think we've really got to look into that group and their kind of lived experience in education. I hope that answered your question, Lizzie.
Absolutely, very important group, and how we can realise everyone's potential through this. I think it wants to serve everyone for success in the future of the economy. So absolutely. Tristan.
I think Pete's absolutely right, you know, to raise issues of equity. I think that's so profoundly important. I think allied to that is the question of how our specifications are designed in terms of social awareness and how they address the contemporary world. There's a brief part of the report that looks at that, but it is quite brief. And I think that's something that really needs quite a lot of thought. I'll give you an example. You know, English language literature is arguably the most diverse form of literature in existence. But if you look at GCSE English literature, A-level English literature, you won't get that from the spec. And I think that is an area that needs to be addressed in a very direct way.
Thanks, Tristan. So definitely diversity of and I think that was coming through the research that we've shared. Hayley, I don't know if you want to kind of say a bit of that about what learners wanted to hear through their curriculum.
Yeah, we heard quite a lot from learners about, and this was kind of open-ended questions, so we didn't probe this, but we heard a lot from learners about how they wanted their curriculum to really reflect the world around them and the things that they were interested in, and to be able to look at things from those global perspectives, to think about things in ways that they felt the curriculum wasn't allowing them to do. So that was definitely something that actually employers as well, to some extent, really wanted to see, that kind of 360-degree view of the world a little bit more.
And from your perspective, Hayley, one thing that you think we'd like to see should change in the system that would make a difference for the next generation?
Yeah, I think a version of what Pete says around how we can really muster our efforts around creating a more personalised approach for some learners for whom probably right from Key Stage 1, the system is just not quite working for, and that trajectory that they then get onto by the time they're in Key Stage 4 and beyond, that means the gap they have to fill to get back onto what is the recognised track is almost just impossible for them. And to really look at how very early on in the system we can really personalise an approach for them that recognises their achievement, but also is an enriching curriculum that's working for them. Because I feel like certainly at 16, the deficit view some young people have of themselves, I think, is very, very problematic, and is dictating things much later in life for them. And I feel we can probably fix that with a stitch in time somewhere in Key Stage 2 or Key Stage 3 that would lead into much more positive outcomes in Key Stage 4.
Thanks, Hayley. That's a nice optimistic kind of point to start to draw this discussion to the close. In terms of next phases of the research, where we've taken this, Hayley, do you want to just talk through kind of what we're doing next?
Yeah, so we are working with an external research partner to really get into the weeds of some of this research. So in phase 1, we very deliberately did the broad brush grassroots kind of approach. And from that, we've set some themes. So there's two kind of key pieces of research that we're doing now. One is to really look at what are those skills? What should the curriculum be in Key Stage 4 and post 16 that really meet some of these huge challenges that we have? What should learners actually be doing? And around that, we might need to think about what should learners then not be doing, because that we can't put more hours into the week, certainly in Key Stage 4. So just a really detailed piece of practitioner-led research that's going to tell us what can be done and what should be done and what the impact of that might be. And then the second part of that is to say, how should we best assess those things? And we're thinking about accountability, although obviously that's slightly outside of our scope as Pearson, the awarding body, but we can certainly think about how we can use technology and design assessment systems to best capture those things that are really going to meet the needs of learners and showcase what they can do, and also allow end users, employers and universities to really make the right selection decisions based on a really full and good view of what learners actually can and can't do.
Thanks, Hayley. And thanks, Pete, and thanks, Tristan, for joining us on this really interesting but big question discussion. And I'm sure this, as Hayley's alluded to, is only the beginning of the conversation, and there's been an awful lot of other work that's been going on by lots of different people thinking in this space. And I think what's refreshing is that there's probably some principles and some broad consensus starting to emerge about kind of things that we could perhaps iterate in the system or kind of just evolve to try and address some of those kind of key fundamentals. I saw in the a couple of the questions, just to link to the report, we'll make sure that's being shared after this session, so people can have a bit of a deep dive into that. And as always, if there's any questions that come out of that or any points that people want to express with us, please do get in touch. It's been a really great session. Thank you very much for all the questions. We haven't been able to go through all of them, but I think it's been quite an entertaining session, and it's really great to hear the diversity of thought that's out there. Thank you.